So I'd like to invite our three panelists up who will be trying to ask questions of the other three panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Marcos Novak. He's a professor at UCSB, where he is director of the Trans Lab, a self-proclaimed trans architect. He is a cyber theorist and designer of digital environments. His design work has been exhibited internationally, and he wrote the influential chapter, Liquid Architectures in Cyberspace, for Michael Benedict's Cyberspace First Steps. Second, I'd like to introduce Tom Povich. He's a visiting professor at SciArc and an adjunct professor of architecture at RMIT. He has taught, lectured, and exhibited throughout Europe, Japan, and the United States. In 1992, he established Tom Povich Architecture, a research, architecture, and design practice producing projects that combine the use of digital tools and manufacturing technologies for the conception and realization of projects at varying scales. And lastly, I'd like to invite up Nick Piska, and he's currently Senior Automation Consultant and Senior Project Consultant at Gary Technologies. He's also teaching scripting for architectural design here at USC and has taught previously at UCSB and at SciArc. He's author of YSYT-MyMEL Basics for Designers. Welcome, Nick. And then if we can get Roland and Mark as well to come up, as well as Casey. And in the brief amount of time left, I would like to kind of go back to the forum of this and maybe shoot the first question out before it goes into its own self-organization. And return to the idea of the parametric urbanism and to say if one had the optimism of creating a manifesto from the day of what does parametric urbanism offer the city, how might these scripted protocols or the kind of simulations that we've been seeing, which were fascinating, be able to be applied to the city and to urbanism in general?
Can I just jump in? That's great. I think the question of urbanism and what we can do about it is a really important question. And so the topic is already rich. And I think the way it's been framed with Dean Ma's statement about the combination and coordination and control of forces and the bottom-up instrumentality, and then Manuel's implication of all sorts of things, but especially of the biological, is really, really intriguing. And there couldn't be a better grouping of people to show just how much control we have over certain, about both the computational and the material, as we've seen. And of course, it's all happening while at the same time we're making cities at an incredible rate in China and then all over the world. We're also making a mess at an incredible rate. And I want to I'm trying to say something, quite a lot of things very quickly, so I apologize for that. Liquid architectures, which was mentioned, is already 30 years old, and it began parametrically with a solid modeler called Euclid, parametric solid modeler called Euclid, and with scripting and programming and generativity way back when. It quickly became apparent that it wasn't just about that, and that actually it was a bigger issue having to do with the balance of the rigorous and rigid and the rigorous and fluid, which had a cultural dimension right from the onset. And I'm trying to bring this back to the making of cities. We also heard about dimensionality and its problems. We have an incredible degree of control of material. We have an incredible capacity for building things. We have unprecedented amounts of information. And yet, there is this question of what a parameter is. If this is a meter, a parameter is a variable that stands next to it, parameter, into which you insert a value, and then things change. We have this capacity for making cities, but we're making a mess of our cities. So if you speak parametrically, what values are we inserting into our cities, and why aren't they working? In other words, pink the color pink is a parameter for elephants. There's a pink elephant in the room. And the problem with the pink elephant is that the things that we've seen that we can make beautiful buildings and beautiful forms, but may not make beautiful cities, or may make beautiful cities but not beautiful cities to live in. I think the problem in this is not one of our mastery of everything that we've seen, but one of values. Like, what values do we insert into what system? And what I want to turn this into a question to everyone about is, isn't it clear that we already have a parametric urbanism? The parametric urbanism has the parameters that build the kinds of cities that we have in LA, for example, a great deal of boxes made of stucco. And those parameters are actually quite well optimized for the production of short-term profit. It's not that they're not parametric, it's that they're parametric for the wrong thing. And we're not really going to contend with urbanism until we figure out how to turn these machines into machines that affect the real problem. Now, the real problem, however, is not one of construction. It's not one of, do we know how to build? We do know how to build. The real problem is that we don't have the value system by which to build the things that we would like. And if we're talking about agents, and we're talking about behavior and desire and so on, the BDI model, shouldn't it be then that what needs to be computed is the value system of the power structure that governs us in order to make these things, and of the users, the populations that occupy them, such that they would make the cities that would be better for us, not only in the historical sense, because we can't go back, but in the future sense. So in that regard, I want that to become a question about how to turn these operations into a social instrument that is changing a population of people to produce certain kinds of things. Right, so there's a way implied in Casey's presence, and in everyone's presence, and in the presence of this event, but it really needs to become broader, of how to engineer, or at least encourage, if you don't want to engineer, a social and economic transformation that will produce urbanism, and to call that parametric and not parameters as in let's make it bigger, let's make it smaller. Because I don't want that last comment to sound critical, I want to actually applaud and encourage to the audience that all of this is predicated on an incredible precision, which is both at the level of fabrication and goes all the way down to the molecular. Okay, that's a big comment, but I had to get it out. Thank you. If anyone can take that on, please jump in.
That's very difficult to take on. I'm going to attempt it in a half-hearted way. The question perhaps is really whose agency then? And looking at it from the point of view of a designer, it's the systems I'm playing around with at like the urban project we looked at a diagrammatic level. It's simply talking about the I become the fitness criteria for the project. So it's judged at a whole series of levels individually. But of course, if we're going to put this forward as a serious, robust model for urban design, then the agency is obviously going to be taken out of the hands of a single person. That's going to become the agency of many people. And in some ways, I see these types of distributed models for design as actually being a way of distributing design intention. And so, and I guess that was what I was trying to get at with the remark about shifting away from the graphic nature of proposals, which have a singular vision. But it also, so that hasn't really answered your question. I will engage one other part of your question, which is evaluation and where evaluation operates at. And do you see evaluation in the processes that we're discussing operate at the micro scale? So an agent evaluates its current position. Evaluation operates at the macro scale, like what is produced and how you evaluate that. Now, I found it interesting the comment that Casey made about at what point do you see something that emerges from the system, and if there's not enough order within the system, how do you impose order upon that? So I'm interested in what evaluations we make at the macro scale. And the last thing is, perhaps it feeds into what Manuel was talking about in terms of the evolution of evaluation. How does evaluation operate across the timescale of these systems evolving? So I don't think it was really an answer, it was really a categorization.
I shouldn't take over the whole thing. I think there might be more responses and more comments. So.
I always like coming in after Marcos because Marcos kind of covers the base I wanted to cover anyway, so I'm going to kind of take on Marcos a little bit. I think what's interesting about the conversation today, and I think a lot of conversation that we have about digital architecture and processes, is that I think we have to think about that we are actually in many architectures, but we're actually dealing with an architecture of conjecture as opposed to an architecture of canons. So we're kind of disrupting systems that are in place which are kind of normative architectural procedures, and these procedures open up a whole bunch of possibilities for us to investigate as what architectures of practice actually has to offer in terms of its conjecture, which precedes theory, and how that theory can actually become normative practice. So one of the things that kind of came up interestingly at a conference in Belgium recently was that one of the Belgian architects suggested he was creating crime. And I suggested, well, to create a crime, you actually have to be a criminal, it has to be a crime. Criminal investigation, meaning that you have to disrupt a particular order or a law. Now, what I think about what I'm seeing today is that all of our panelists here have created a crime. Now, Eric Owen Moss recently suggested that great architecture has to actually perform a crime because criminal activity is something that acts out of normal behavior. So what we're actually now seeing is that this criminal activity, so-called, has to find a place, meaning a place for us to kind of subject it to a rigorous methodology to produce an outcome. Now, if I think about Craig Venter, who is a well-known scientist, who through Sorcerer, through expeditions, they scour the oceans and actually discover bacteria. And this bacteria, which is largely invisible, is siphoned through a number of filtering systems. These filtering systems then produce what you call phenomenological research with a scientific twist, which enables us to have outcomes which have medicinal and microbiological outcomes, which kind of produces what we could call a tipping point. And this tipping point is yet to arrive in architecture of the digital. What I would tend to think is that we have to now look at this paradigm shift in thinking and how this architecture can actually permeate normality. Now, I think that the way architecture is shifting at the moment, it's that the research we're seeing here today is kind of like in a way pejorative, but at the same time, it's dealing with the possibilities that the scripting could produce another method of practice and practical evolution. Meaning the scripting itself takes the designer out and kind of does what you would call Linus Torvalds would think about in terms of open source kind of architecture, where the scripting itself becomes form. And this form has the possibility of evolution beyond the author. And this authorship potential can kind of produce valuable outcomes, both urbanistically, parametrically, and also in all forms of creativity. And if you think about how urbanism is evolving, and I was having a discussion with Dean Ma earlier today, I was saying how wonderful it would be that if this kind of urbanism could actually evolve through a scripting system that kind of had a much wider participation rather than a one author. That means that we use a scale shift, similar to kind of an open source system, to create a language that builds upon the original authorship. That means the invisible becomes visible, and that would be an interesting architectural paradigm shift for us to undertake. So I would kind of throw this back to the panel and see how they feel about that kind of proposition.
I'm going to intercept Tom because there's a way to answer that doesn't really get to the issue. There's a way of doing this and not changing anything about urbanism, and to make it tangible and also addressable by the kinds of things that everyone is doing. Let me ask it as a very simple question. What Twitter message would you send to everybody in the world who receives Twitter tweets such that urbanism would change? I think that is a problem, right? But it's not a problem of organizing. It's all of these things. It's molecular and elemental and all of that. But it has to do with the agents whose intentions who are intentional but have. But it would actually organize the actors. And if you had the blueberries of all the executives in the world, what single image before they blocked you would you send them, right? Or an email or whatever instruction would you send them such that the value system, the motives and incentives of making cities would change in a way that would actually change cities. That is what needs to be programmed. That is where the fault is.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
Okay, now I'll answer Marcos's question. Marcos, isn't a tweet actually code?
It is, exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. It is code, but it is not code addressing the making of a form. It is the code addressing the making of a population. I'm back from Japan, and I'm curious about why Japan is the way it is. And as far as I can tell, it's because of Shinto and an idea in Shinto called kami. And those of you who are Japanese know what I'm talking about. It has to do with assigning not a Western, a totally Eastern idea of godhood to something that is extraordinary. You marinate a culture in that instruction for a few centuries, and you go by a present, and it's beautiful. And the whole city is clean, and everything is fine. That's a single instruction. You put it into a society, psh, you know? Now that's interesting.
Okay, so let's
I can address your questions on one level, but it's not the level where it meets urbanism. So that's why I'm feeling reticent.
Address it. Don't be reticent. Jump in.
No, but I can't address it. I mean, we're trying to bring the discourse back to urbanism, and I can address it on other levels, but not that one. So that's why I'm...
Or try.
I can actually, hold on a second. Marcos, I can say something. Well, I'll try to address this in terms of urbanism, and I'm going to say something somewhat controversial, but I'm going to make the claim that the phrase parametric urbanism is actually an oxymoron, and that, at least in the way that I define and what Roland had defined in his lecture, which I found to be really refreshing at the end, was that there are two components to a parametric system. One is that you have a permanent link, or is a permanent relationship between two elements, whether it's numerical or geometric or anything like that. But then the other thing is that you have this static topology, which is something that Roland had mentioned as well. So parametric links, at least the characteristic of a parametric link, is intensive, and that it cannot be broken apart. And the way that I think about this, at least in terms of a computational logic, is making a distinction between the understanding of how you query something versus how you link or you assign something. And I think it's a major thing. So I think something that would actually make a more aggressive statement about the idea of parametric urbanism would be, rather than having this wordplay where parametric and algorithmic seem to almost be interchangeable now, instead isolate both of those techniques, because the idea of an algorithmic urbanism is almost redundant. I mean, in every sense of the word, algorithmic processes take over an urban environment. In a city, I would even consider it to be somewhat of a macrobial growth system, which is independent of any sort of parametric system. Now, there are hierarchies that try to influence that, and I would almost think that if you had the position to make a statement on Twitter, which would be addressed to anybody, you're already working at a top-down hierarchical level, and those never work. I mean, you could send a Twitter out and say Neda Sultan was shot in Tehran, but that didn't stop the political arrangement that occurred in Iran, which is something that already actually occurred. So I'm not entirely...
So let me ask you a question. So what's the difference, we'd say, okay, let's look at Linux, for example. What's the difference, say, Linux as a source code and say what Roland's doing and what you're doing, for example, in parametric modeling, which means you're actually adding. It's a top-down, bottom-up approach anyway, so it's kind of dynamic system. So who's the author? Is the author the information, or does the information or the author get lost in the information, or is the process inside the information something that has a pattern evolution?
It's a combination of all those factors. I mean, I'd love to get lost in it, but at this current state we're at right now, I mean, it's evident in the work as well with what was shown earlier, is that the designers of the code, you call it designers of the code, the writers, the authors, they are constantly in the feedback loop process. So they're never going to get lost because they're forcing the stop to occur. I mean, when you look at somebody like Doc Bailey's work, where he created an output, which is a visualization of particle systems, and he created he explored the whole search space of particle dynamics and particle illumination. He had to develop a whole other tool to go through and set up the fitness criteria for that. But right now, in this setting, we're currently dealing with a forced stop, and that forced stop is allowing the authors to still have control of the situation.
I think the authorship question's really it shouldn't even be questioned. I think there's so much craft and decision making that goes into any of the software that the three of us exhibited. I don't see how there can be a claim made that there's any authorship removed at all from that work.
Well,
Maybe that's
actually,
not your question.
I'm suggesting that your project, for example, doesn't require authorship. That in fact the authorship's actually in the source code. And the idea when you stop and start the actual button is actually negative. I mean, it's negligible. So the work actually evolves.
That's what I totally disagree with. Yeah.
But the code is not Who's the author of the code?
I agree, Tom. There's definitely distributed authorship. I mean, Casey writes a piece of software that I use, that I write libraries for, that then goes on the web and somebody else uses that to make a project. So in a way, yes, of course, partly Casey's the author of my work, partly maybe I'm the author of some of the work that somebody else has done with that code. But ultimately, I think that there is this, there's a little bit too much within the critique of algorithmic work. There's too much of this kind of belief that look no hands, and in reality, I think that I would claim the things that I design are very much within control, and I would always claim to have,
But let me ask you another question. Why is it all your three projects, maybe Casey not so much, why are we looking at so much formalism? Why are we looking at so much kind of discussion about, I mean, there's a kind of I suppose it's almost like there's no cognitive and there's no kind of body participation itself. It's actually looking at materiality, it's looking at surface, and it's looking how we can actually understand form. But it doesn't actually deal with the sentient principles, which is what architecture really should be about. So when Marcos mentioned the behavior, is there a behavior system which is dealing with the primary faculties that humans actually relate to, or are we just dealing with kind of the ocular, which is what Western civilization has been so interested in for such a long time? Valuing the other faculties which are primary, because what I think Casey's doing, in a way, it's kind of an immersive world, and this immersive world has a kind of evolutionary system that has the potential for multivariant environments. And if you take the idea of this system disrupting the current consumption of behavior that architecture is producing, then I would think that what Marcos is saying is correct. We are kind of
No.
So I kind of have to agree with you to some degree, but what you guys are doing, you are disrupting a system. So this idea of authorship comes into it because you are coding language, and this language is evolutionary, and it hasn't got a kind of a stop-start, meaning that you can add value to it by disrupting existing conditions by adding other conditions upon these conditions. Like Mark Forness and I had a conversation about this before.
But are you dichotomizing the formal and the human in some way, or I think I made sure at the end of my little speech to say that the precision was really necessary. Anything cognitive and anything at all, for that matter, is deeply, deeply formal. The farther you go into matter, the more you realize that things react specifically to geometries and positions in space. You can become subatomic, or you can become neural. Your memories are accumulations of protein along neural pathways. Protein is a string that folds very precisely in space to make a geometry to which other molecules can attach. The formal is the deepest thing in the universe. There is nothing without the formal. Upon it, we build all sorts of other stuff. So I don't think that's,
I primarily agree with your opening comments. I'm really sympathetic towards that argument. You answered it in a weak way. I think that kind of consideration isn't going to come from me. Like, I'm interested in something very specific, and while I'm sympathetic towards that understanding, I'm really torn, but I'm compelled to work in this more formal way.
let me try to bridge this, because I think when I see all this work, I see it and appreciate it as what it is. But at the same time, you know, in architecture, there's a long history of looking at a diagram and understanding that it stands for all sorts of other things. And so I think these things can be seen as forms and images and architecture and all that. And I wouldn't shy at all away from the formal. But I would say that they can also be read as models of how to affect a society, or how to create an urbanism. The things that are growing are potential models of human, social, economic organization, and some of them would make societies that are, you know, good to live in, and some of them would be totally horrible to live in if you actually imagine them in a higher dimensionality. And I want to get back to Manuel's point about degrees of freedom and dimensionality in the space of the search. All of this work that we saw couldn't have been done if each of you didn't actually know how to program and deal with the precisions both at the algorithmic level and at the level of particular fabrications. So you've become programmers, and you've learned whatever science is necessary to attend to that, to make things. Now, from my vantage point, having started in 1979 and seeing that's like tremendous. At the same time, it's not the battle that it was in 79. And when I was telling people that, look, you're in architecture, but you're going to have to learn how to program, people mostly shot at me. You know, now it's lauded. But that never stops. I'm going to propose and ask you, you know, as a way of dealing with the very hairy, difficult problem that Manuel brought up, that at this point, the way to deal with it is to learn from the mechanisms of life. Life has no problem computing such numbers, but you don't compute it with computers. You compute it with bacteria. You compute it with molecules. You compute it in the wet lab. I don't know that we're quite ready. I think we at UCSB, and my PhD students and I, and people at CNSI at UCLA and CNSI at UCSB are beginning to do that. But I'm going to propose to architects that, you know, 30 years from now, there'll be an event like this in which we won't be looking at computer models, we'll be looking at biological models of urbanism. Biological models that will generate buildings, but the people working on them, the people sitting at this end of this side of the table, will be the people who actually, instead of writing a program, have mixed the right things and had them grow, and from them derive that. What do you think of that? I mean, how do you imagine beyond the digital? Parametric or post-parametric urbanism, but not just through the digitals and the simulated, but through the enacted computation of the world.
I think it's going to happen much quicker than 30 years.
I think so too. Yeah.
Well, if you believe what Kurzweil's talking about, then we're talking about singularity in 2029, or let's be generous, say 2050.
Right, but okay, again, another sort of strange thing about a perspective such as mine. I was an undergraduate when this all started, and we have undergraduates in the room. Then I would have said, you know, what I told myself, that I've got to learn how to do this. And my teachers didn't know what I was talking about, but I did it anyway. Now I would say to the undergraduates in the room, go to the biology department, you know, figure out what the machinery of life actually is and make something with it. Well, would you go with that?
Well, I tell students at SCIARC all the time to go to the biology department. We don't have one.
That's the whole thing.
I mean, I think that's entirely true. That will be the forefront. But I think that the kind of work we're talking about today will evolve and still will be extraordinarily relevant at that time, but used in a very different way than it won't be. Well, it'll be more the general process and just integrated into the pipeline entirely rather than being the forefront of things.
Right.
Yeah, but do you mean pure biology or more the nanotechnology, more engineered systems? I'm just curious.
Well, I think it's really, really pretty huge, but I think if you try to take it step by step to reason it out, it used to be an argument to say that someone would have to learn how to program or script.
Sure.
That argument is okay. The next argument is that you really have to know your math and you have to know the science of dynamical systems and nonlinear systems and all of that. That's becoming assimilated, and it's evident in this work. I think the next one is that you actually have to get farther and farther into science, into different kinds of sciences, not as something attendant, but as something integral. Mm-hmm. And eventually you'll actually have to do it as if it were part of your stuff on your studio. I mean, all of those things have to be anticipated and not resisted. They have to be accelerated, I would say.
Marcus, but you're completely right, but I don't think it's a dichotomy because
It's not a dichotomy.
because people use software, right, in simulation to study biological systems. So to me, it's a continuum, from simple rule-based systems to both complex currently simulations of evolution or biological systems.
I don't think it's going to be abandoned, but it isn't the same forefront that it was. Like, you know, those of us who were there, like yourself, who saw this happen, know that it's not the same. Now this is de facto. It's not the frontier. It's the case. It's status quo. Try to get through school without doing it, right? You're not going to make it.
But
So if you're serious, if you've done this and you're serious about communicating something to someone, you have to say this isn't the frontier. Go find the frontier.
You know, if you go back 20 years ago, I'll say 30 years ago, you were talking about architecture with semantics. You were talking about Derrida. Everybody had to have his favorite philosopher.
This was even before that.
Sorry, 50 years ago.
Derrida was, if you get into structuralism and post-structuralism, it does take you back 50 years.
Right, okay. Right, what I was going to say was that was like 50 years ago. Let's agree on that. Yeah, okay, 50 years.
I spoke specifically of 30.
Let's agree, 20-year difference here. So what we're now saying is that at the time architects are thinking about meaning, now architects are thinking about generative. Architects are thinking about performative, and that's really the crucial difference, I would say.
Is that a question?
No, well,
well,
yes or no?
Well, I don't think, as Lev said, it's not a matter of dichotomizing. I think people were thinking of the performative and the generative then, and they were thinking also of the ecological. It just that all the green stuff that was there just was incredibly ugly, and now it's nicer. But here's the problem I'm having. All of this can be debated, but the thing is that we tend as architects to speak of these things in a kind of isolation chamber, as if the truth isn't there. This is the pink elephant in the room. Now, green is big, right? Let's all go invest in green. The fact is that the green is going to become a huge economic bubble. It's going to go up and up and up. People will invest in it, and it's going to come crashing down for economic reasons of motive and incentive that have nothing to do with architecture, but that have every effect in the making of cities and in the living in them. And it doesn't matter how beautiful the boxes we make are. Dubai will crash, some economical system will crash because there is too much incentive in the rise and fall. People make things rise, and the green, as wonderful as it is, the sustainable, the ecological, all this, is another bubble that is going to burst because the premises have not been discussed. It doesn't matter, how you make your pyramid as long as you're working for the pharaoh. You have to have a conversation with the pharaoh to change that.
May I make a suggestion?
Yeah. So could, to get it recorded, could you possibly take it from up here?
I can speak really loud.
No, but it's got to be recorded on the video.
So I can get it.
Unless someone was
Just a very simple thing. That's why I didn't even want to have the microphone. When I began my talk, I said that there's two ways of using simulations. One would be the excellent way that we just saw right now as form-finding procedures, which I love them. Now I want to have those things in my house. I just felt like becoming a programmer again. Just seeing how simple programs can generate such complex, incredible shapes. But how do we connect it to urbanism? That was your original question, right? And so, first of all, let's not think about urbanism just as infrastructure, roads and buildings and so on, but let's think about them as being formed, as a city being formed by communities, by organizations, right? Each one has its own parameters. Communities' parameters are the density of the network, for instance, how many friends, how much the friends of your friends know the friends of my friends, and so on. The level of solidarity. Organizations have legitimacy because they always have authority structures. How much legitimacy the organization is, how many levels of hierarchy there are. Once we then have those entities, then we put them in a neighborhood, and the neighborhood now is going to have its own parameters. So if we build from the bottom up with BDI agents at the bottom for persons, then we could see parallels between the formal properties of each one of those entities, not just cities in general, but for instance, the connectivity in communities. A lot of the things that we saw right now had to do with connectivity, right? And so we might then be able to see parallels between the connectivities generated in a completely abstract way, and now, hey, what would happen if we actually change the connectivity of communities to follow that? If we had the other model, right, the one with BDI agents, and then we could immediately test ideas from one realm, which is purely formal, so to speak, because now we have, in a way, found what you just said before, the form of communities. It's the form of their networks and the degrees of intensity of their solidarities, right? Their parameters. So if we had that very well figured out, then we can make study parallels, the symmetries, for instance, that appear here. Could those symmetries be of significance in an organization? Can an organization be built with symmetries like that? Well, let's test it. Let's test it in the simulation. Let's see what would happen. Or just to use the example that you used, a single seed in Japan that has managed to produce in a kind of fractal way an entire culture. Well, you produce that because it has effects at a personal level, at the way you lead your life and your personal ethics, has effects at the community level, has effects at the organizational level, right? And so in order to track how that single tweet would filter up and expand and morphogenetically unfold, we would need to build a city from the bottom up with all the different layers, have it there in the computer so we could test the formal parallels between the two.
That's exactly right. The only word that isn't in there, I think it's how can I say it? The comments are sympathetic, but the word is really quite important. It's the word value. Like behavior and what was it? Behavior, desire, and intention. All of those things are actually
Belief, desire,
belief, desire, and
values
intention.
come in there as beliefs and as desires, right?
But here's the curious thing, and it's also an interesting East-West. The West has this kind of culture of individualism, and the East does not. Not that there aren't individuals there and people who are more collective here. That I don't mean to make a silly division.
Sure.
But BDI is definitely on the side of individual agents with no overarching value. And if you look at the planet and the mess of it, the mess of it is because there is not sufficient valuation of the communal. There's no sense. And we have to persuade one another not to pollute the planet and not to breathe each other's trash. When we have no sense of the whole.
Just another parameter, how much the beliefs and desires of the agents are shared. If there's a high sharing in the sharing parameter, right? And a lot of the beliefs and desires are shared, you're gonna get a communal effect.
Right.
If they are not shared, everyone wants its own Christmas ornaments and everyone wants its own little thing. Well, then we get a lot more individualism. So you can accommodate VDI agents to behave in a more communal way.
And these things that we saw are perfect models that way. If you can read all of these examples that we saw and the work of Tom and Nick and many people in the room for that matter as such examples. The final little spice in the soup. Thermodynamics, and I wrote down someplace in here on my scribblings the thermodynamics of values, and it could be behavior and so on. But there's a really disturbing, incontestable fact in the laws of thermodynamics, and that is that any system that produces energy also produces disorder. So the more we urbanize and civilize and produce finer and finer and more dense machines like this, the more the byproduct of that is necessarily, that's not an opinion, it's nothing soft about that, the more necessarily the byproduct is mess, entropy, and disorder. The only way that we know about it is to make cycles, where the waste of one thing is the food of the other.
There's another question.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to make kind of a few points of observation addressing the promising kind of influence that the practitioners today presenting here to the to the future urbanism. on one hand, obviously, you can be the soldiers and constantly building pieces that contribute to a larger urbanism, and as a role of architect. But what is really frustrating today is to see any of you with fantastic work. None of you have actually collaborated with, let's see, NSF, that places are making policies on how national grant and finances get actually directed to. That's the other is none of you actually worked with industries that actually are predetermined to how to build our cities. In other words, how you influence the industry that will contribute to millions and millions square meter and billions and billions dollars, and in building our cities. Lastly, have not, following Tom's, I have not really kind of observing you are making a, I wouldn't call it criminal act, but actually violating act that actually making conditions of urbanism to a national catastrophe, and creating this kind of virtual catastrophe, so that if we are not investing in a way that we're looking for, and it will never happen. A little story of that is there is the nuclear scientist from China called Chen Xuesen. Professor Chen worked for Caltech, and he was a pupil of von Karman as the kind of father of nuclear scientists. At that time, it was basically abstract physics, and that has no consequence of how the military strategy, how the world finance is being invested. But all of a sudden, the U.S. think China was a spy, and Chen Xuesen being the almost sitting like yourself here in that age, and extremely promising in this nuclear physics, but was kicked out of U.S. and driven back to China, and all of a sudden he was embraced by devise a national nuclear strategy that has everything to do with how the city is being made, both in politically, financially, and geographically. Look what's happened. That's what happened. So what I mean is that all this promising technology and the courage to venture into the future of what urbanism is must be connected to the, I wouldn't say charming factor of the society. Obviously, we all love it, but actually power of the society, and then really kind of induce it to what really happens. And if in 5 years we're going to have another forum like this, I want to see one or at least 3 of you are connecting with World Bank and investing billions of dollars to build cities somewhere in the Far East that actually could be self-destructing when the temperature rises to 3 degrees. That's the story we have to make. If we can't stop 2 degree changing next 15 years, we're gonna die. That's the Twitter message, right? Okay, so the only way that reverse it is to doing this. Is that some proposal? But again, highly promising. But in 5 years, we do it again. It's still highly promising, but infactual, and we fail. That's just everything that that's just adding. Okay.
With that, I think we should. Oh, do you have another comment? I was just going to wrap up for lunch.
We are running way behind. This has been a fabulous roundtable discussion. We're going to break for lunch now. Can I set the time for 3:30 for the next session? That's exactly 45 minutes time. And thank you for all this fantastic discussion.